Hello, and welcome to the Distorted Mindset Podcast, where we explore the interdigital realms behind our favorite video games. I'm your host, Johnathan Dunslow, and today we are going to be diving into the topic of genres of horror games. More particularly, we will be analyzing the psychological effects of different narrative horror games. These experiences have been created for years through the usage of different narrative formats, such as survival, interactive drama storytelling, and psychological horror. In today's episode, we will discuss these formats further to understand how these psychological effects of these different narrative horror games impact the player's mindset through their experience. We will look closely at examining three distinct horror games: Friday the 13th the game, Until Dawn, and Silent Hill 2. I will also be sharing some of my own experiences with these games to provide a personal experience within the analysis. To begin this discussion, let's talk about horror video games. Now, what are horror video games exactly? The article titled, "The Psychology of Horror Games in Gaming, Fear, Thrills, and Player Experience" by the publisher World of the Abyss quotes, "In horror games, fear is endured through the various psychological techniques, including suspenseful pacing, eerie soundscapes, surprises, and the dark, unsettling environments. These elements trigger the brain's fear response, releasing adrenaline and heightening a player's senses." End quote. Primarily, these games work to create the emotions of tension, fear, and psychological discomfort for players. Specifically focus on the narrative, interactive gameplay, and the overall atmosphere/setting that the game plot takes place in. These forms of game construction work cohesively together to have an impact on the psychological effects on players throughout their gaming experience. Psychological effects such as stress, anxiety, empathy, and guilt of an individual can impact their decision-making while playing the games and overall alter the course of the game's narrative outcome. Before we dive into the analysis of these three games, let's break down the concept of narrative structures within horror games. So, what is narrative structures within video games? Looking at the reading titled, "From Novels to Video Games, Romantic Love and Narrative Form in Japanese Visual Novels and Romance Adventure Games" by author Sacho Kimaki, she explores the significant role of narrative structures within video games, particularly explaining where the early roots of these video games evolved. Kimako quotes, "The visual novel genre originally began as horror games such as Ogresko and Kamachi no Yor, in which the player makes multiple attempts to escape from or prevent the doomed death." She explains further about the basic concepts around the narrative structures of horror visual novels. The player's decision-making is quite unique as it drives the storyline, making each experience different from the last or sometimes the exact same. The idea of a bad ending within horror games is something most players try to avoid. This feeling of dying from a killer or killing off your favorite character is a bad scenario that raises the feelings of stress and tension during these playthroughs. As horror games evolved over the years, more genres began to create, which brought new complex storylines and storytelling amongst players and the exciting outcomes during one's play through experiencing the games based on their choices made. Together, narrative structures within horror games can be similar based on a player's decision-making, but also completely different from the incorporation of the genre which the storyline takes place in. Now, let's dive into our first narrative horror game, beginning with survival horror games. So, what are they exactly? This gaming genre is known for its fast-paced through that are about the fight for survival. It has many deciding factors involved for whether a player is going to live or unfortunately die from their poor decision-making. The gameplay features has players exploring around the map for resources to escape, health supplies, weapons for defense, and in some cases the company of fellow players to help assist during their escape. Horror games often need players to tread carefully while trying to gather these needs for escape, but also at the same time trying not to be killed and have their story of survival come to the very end. Constant fear, stress, atmosphere, stamina, health, jump scares, and the impact of other player decisions are just some of the deciding factors within this fight-to-live gaming genre. Furthering this discussion is the book titled The Dark Side of Gameplay, Controversial Issues in Playful Environments by authors Terrell Evera Mornson, Jonah Livroff, and Ashley M.L. Brown. These authors summarize the dark side of game playing and the different forms of how to play, from being the hero to save others, to sacrificing yourself for another players, or killing off others to save yourself. These decisions are open to players and allow different pathways to affect the story outcome for themselves and others. Mornson, Livroff, and M.L. Brown quote, "One player can find this state of playfulness while balanced between rules, abilities, and goals, while another can find it between fiction, actions, and reality, or any combination of these and several other aspects of what we recognize as games." End quote. In horror games, there are different forms of players and how they utilize the game mechanics. You have some players who want to use their abilities in achieving their end goal. However, there are players that find enjoyment in the more immersive narratives revolving around the feelings of the psychological impacts of the horror experience. Now, let's connect this analysis further with a game from this gaming genre. Friday the 13th, the game, from the creators at Gun Media, it was released in 2017. It is known for its intense multiplayer horror game that involves the survivors trying to escape from a camp alive while trying to outrun the killer Jason Voorhees. The constant tension of avoiding Jason while trying to plot the quickest escape with your fellow campers makes it a survival game that has plenty of possible outcomes to whether a player will live or survive based on their decision making. As a Friday the 13th fan, this game is an all-time favorite of mine that I continue to play each and every day, as its usage of psychological impacts from its unique narrative-structured game. Stress and anxiety was something I experienced during my gameplay, trying to find the resources to escape, attempting to repair getaway vehicles while also feeling very vulnerable while trying not to be detected by Jason's senses made the game such a thrilling experience. I felt excitement and adrenaline from narrowly escaping his grasp and working together to fight him off with fellow teammates was such a rush through my blood. The combination of the narrative depth in gameplay and the psychological tension experienced help leave a lasting impact from a player standpoint to be experienced over and over again. Alright, let's move on to our second horror game genre, being interactive drama storytelling. So, what is interactive drama storytelling horror games? So, this genre of horror games focus upon storytelling within the horror genre in order to create an impactful experience for players. These games focus on the story upon decision making from the players themselves, and ultimately, it's their choice that will end up affecting the outcome of the story, for the better or for the worse. Quick decision making in situations can be the reason a character dies or lives within your game story. These contributing factors into this genre implements the emotions of stress, fear, anxiety, heartbreak, and the guilt for the wrong decision making. Furthering this discussion on the topic of this game genre, I have a paper from the University of York titled Horror, Guilt, and Shame, Uncomfortable Experiences in Digital Games by authors Chad Phoenix Rose Gowler and Loana Labocos, which explores the feelings of anxiety and fear from coming faced with high-pressure situations in video games. These kind of games can affect a player's decision-making through the limited choices presented to them and having to act fast under immense pressure. Gowler and Labocos quote, "Through providing high-pressure environments with uncertain outcomes and difficult decisions to make, to the experience of loss and exposing players to disturbing themes. However, while excess discomfort can jeopardize player engagement, the findings also indicate that discomfort can provide another facet to gameplay." End quote. Horror games are designed to put players in intense situations where their minds don't have the full capacity to fully understand what choices that are presented to them within a stressful environmental setting. However, it's the psychological effects that cause anxiety, stress, grief, lingering fear, and the suspense that enrich these gaming experiences. These human factors of feeling can be the deciding factor in a narrative-based game and really can redirect the storyline into something unexpected. Continuing on with this conversation, let me introduce one of the most well-known interactive drama storytelling horror games made to this day, Until Dawn. Until Dawn, from the creators at Sony Interactive Entertainment, is an interactive storytelling drama game released in 2015. The game's structure and story revolves around the concept of the butterfly effect, where the decisions made by the players will alter the story's direction, for the better or for the worse. Quick choices must be made in order to progress the story, and the fear, anxiety, and guilt will end up being too much for some players to handle. The ability to shape the story through this gaming experience on a cold winter night at a lodge in the woods is a perfect setting for this cinematic horror narrative experience. My experience playing this game is what made me come to love this genre of narrative horror games. The emotions that are felt during the play through this interactive drama storytelling games feels like you're placed within a film. The graphics of this game and the visual art contribute to the love of this game for so many gamers. The Until Dawn creators have gone about creating similar interactive drama storytelling narrative horror games through the structure of the butterfly effect. Their newer series, called The Dark Pictures of the Anthology, has continued to grow through their usage of taking real-life event/stories and transforming them into high-stake emotional roller coasters of adventures for players. This game will always be at the top of my pick for the most intense interactive drama storytelling horror games ever created. Alright, it's time to discuss our final horror game genre of the episode, psychological narrative horror games. So what is this gaming genre about? Psychological horror games have psychological elements seen through other horror game genres. However, these games specifically focus upon the psychological effects themselves within their game's narratives and gaming mechanics, creating an environment for jump scares, visual graphic violence. Intense atmosphere and gory narrative-driven storytelling together will create the most impactful experience for players. The goal by this is using these elements to manipulate a player's mind and toy with their emotions in the process. A well-conceived narrative is critical to the overall gameplay, as exploring these dark themes that dive into traumas, fears, human psyche, and different forms of psychological disturbances solidify the gaming experience. Looking at the game mechanics further is an analysis from the book Horror Video Games, Essay on the Fusion of Fear and Play, written by author Bernard Perron. Within the text, Perron discusses the environmental aspects of horror game mechanics that ultimately contribute to the psychological gaming genre that has emerged, primarily focusing upon the game's atmosphere, storytelling, and psychological horror elements, all together create an immersive gaming experience. Perron quotes, "Fog or mist means the player cannot see very far and also allows creatures to get up really close to him before attacking." End quote. Uncertainty is created within these games as fog, just like darkness, through visual limitations. This can build up fear, tension, paranoia, and psychological stress to players experiencing the game. The inability to know what lies ahead within this narrative genre game leaves players in a vulnerable state of mind where their internal fears begin to take over their ability to function properly within an uncomfortable and unfamiliar environment. A prime example of a psychological narrative horror game is Silent Hill 2, published by Konami. Known as a horror game for its unique and impactful usage of psychological horror through storytelling, Silent Hill 2 has players playing through as James Slenderland as he's on a journey to uncover clues from a letter left behind from his deceased wife. The deep narrative, bold atmosphere, violent graphics are just some of the psychological elements presented within this narrative, leaving players unable to forget this gaming experience. Reflecting upon my experience of this game, I can definitely say the feelings still linger inside of me. Thinking back to Perron's discussion on visual limitations within games and how it contributes to an unsettling feeling, it is something that was evident in Silent Hill 2. When walking through the fog, I was feeling very tense. I'm a person who doesn't like the feeling of being trapped. The fog created a feeling of being in a claustrophobic space where you could not fully see where you were going. Walking into an unknown environment through very limited lighting and spatial awareness is something that built up my psychological stress. Furthering the talk about the fog, I felt it was significant not only to the horror game concept but also another layer of James Slenderland's mental state. I felt like I was navigating through James's story by uncovering the hidden truths that were not visually seen at first, through making my way through the fog. The psychological effects I experienced left lingering feelings and memories inside of me about this horror game playthrough. To wrap up this episode, let's review what we explored through this discussion. We have analyzed how the narrative formats, survival, interactive drama storytelling, and psychological horror video games together have created impactful experiences amongst players within the gaming industry based on their game concepts and their narrative aspects. We dived deeper into the psychological effects present within 3 distinct horror games: Friday the 13th the game, Until Dawn, and Silent Hill 2. I've also shared my personal experience of these games firsthand through my own perspectives and exposed the psychological effects present within each particular game that I've encountered and that also many other players have probably encountered playing through. I want to say thank you for tuning into this episode of the Distorted Mind podcast, and I hope you enjoyed our dive into the structures of horror game narratives. Tune into episodes weekly where we continue to break down the world of the gaming industry. Until next time, I'm your host, Johnathan Dunslow, signing off.